Georgia's salt marsh is one of the most biologically productive regions on Earth. Coming up, we'll explore the area and show you some opportunities to enjoy our marshlands. Next on Georgia Outdoors.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible by a grant from Mary Hall Singleton and by the Imlay Foundation.
Over a century ago, poet Sidney Lanier immortalized the Georgia salt marsh. In his poem, The Marshes of Glen, he described a marsh meshed with 1,000,000 veins. This phrase, inspired by the numerous tidal creeks which cut through the marsh, calls to mind an image of the marsh as a living organism. And indeed, the tidal marshes of Georgia's coast pulse with an undeniable life force. But more than metaphor or muse, Georgia's marshlands are an important, unique ecosystem that serves as a home, a nursery, and a feeding ground for an array of wildlife, and provides opportunities for boating, fishing, and simply enjoying the beauty of our coastal marshes. Though Georgia's coast is relatively small, only about 100 miles long, it holds nearly 1/3 of all the salt marsh habitat on the East Coast, over 370,000 acres. Once a series of lagoons, the salt marsh exists between Georgia's mainland and barrier islands. Over thousands of years, rivers filled these lagoons with bio-rich sediment, forming the muddy expanses we see today. In order to better understand the salt marsh, you must begin upriver, where the fresh water transitions to brackish water. We met up with naturalist John Crawford, outfitter Danny Grissett, and a group of kayakers from the Nature Conservancy to explore an important stretch of the Altamaha River, one of the major rivers feeding the salt marshes of our coast.
Well, Altamaha Coastal Tours does guided trips along the lower part of the Altamaha River. The trip that we're doing today is on Cathead Creek. It's a tributary of the Altamaha River. It's about 8 miles long. It's a great area to get to see the transition between the fresh waters and the salt waters. A great river to see a lot of the different wildlife. Just a great jewel that we have here in McIntosh County.
This river system is affected by tides. Georgia's tides range from 6 feet to 9 feet.
Well, this is sort of a transition between marshes and the freshwater river swamp. Georgia has the highest tidal range south of Cape Cod and north of Argentina, and that high tide and the flatness of the countryside allows the tides to push, maybe 60 miles up some of these freshwater rivers. You know, this is just an amazing type of habitat. You can see palms in here on that side, and those are palms that do well. That's sable minor, which is related to the cabbage palmetto. You can still see a lot of the grasses. As you go further upstream, the grasses disappear.
John Crawford, known to many as Crawfish, has a reputation for his vast knowledge of Georgia's diverse coastal ecology.
This is a maple here, swamp maple. I grew up in Savannah area, and so the marshes and the swamps and all were all around me, and for some reason I was always interested in those. I don't ever remember not having an all-consuming interest in natural history. It never has let up, you know. I've just delved into the science of it, and from an early childhood, and you know, it's never gotten boring yet, so it's always something new and exciting. Pickerelweed, a lot of nice wildflowers.
In transitional areas like this, you can experience many different habitats while covering a relatively short distance.
The best way to experience the Cathead Creek is definitely by paddling, by boat. The area was popular with the rice growers at the turn of the century. They cultivated rice for over 100 years, from the late 1790s all the way up to the 20th century. And what they've left is a lot of the irrigation canals for the rice fields, and it provides miles of canoe trails and paddling trails through the area.
This is an old rice field. Over here you can see where it was cleared. What they did was they cleared the trees out, probably pulled the stumps, built dikes around it, put gates in the dikes. Since this is freshwater tidal, they could close off the gates and let it dry out. So, you know, where it would flood every day with the high tide, if they block off the gates, there's so much to see, so little time.
Since rice cultivation ceased in the area over a century ago, the natural forests have rebounded. Along the edges of these canals, an archway of cypress branches hangs overhead. Cypress, with its billowing trunks and drooping branches, is a distinctive tree species throughout the wetlands of the southeast. Though a conifer, cypress is deciduous, losing its needles in wintertime. Here at Cathead Creek, the cypress tree thrives along the water's edge.
This is a tidal freshwater bald cypress area, and it's a globally rare natural community. The Altamaha River has one of the most expansive areas of freshwater tidal bald cypress.
Here, along the freshwater tidal forest, you'll find the same wildlife you see on the banks of any other southern river. Alligators and various wading birds all congregate along the river.
Look at that. That's a yellow belly slider. Wow, that's cool. That's a bold turtle, if you ask me.
The land around the Altamaha is some of the best preserved of its type on Earth.
Areas in other parts of the world that are similar latitude, have historically been altered for longer periods of time and a much greater usage. And we have a system that has been remote and relatively protected. We've protected more than 79,000 acres since 1969.
As the group makes its way downriver, they pass through a variety of habitats. The river widens and narrows and widens again, eventually nearing the zone where the fresh water meets the salt water of the ocean. Freshwater fiddler crabs scurry along the walls of the river bank.
It's a nice mixing zone here, you might say. And the cypress trees are no longer right along the edge of the shore. They're back a ways also, away from the salinity that comes in on the tides with this river. So this is a transition zone. It's a mixing pot, you might say, of plants.
Everything that floats down this river eventually passes through to the salt marsh.
Materials that are floating, whether it's leaves of a cypress tree or a dead, giant cut grass, they eventually add nutrient and substance to the salt marshes here. The clay particles that come down the rivers are what really form the base of the soil for the salt marsh. Without that, the marshes would just disappear.
As the freshwater and saltwater mix, trees disappear and grasses take over. This is the true salt marsh. Thick with mud, inundated by salt water twice daily, the salt marsh may seem like a harsh environment, but it is actually a vibrant and important part of our coastline. One of the best places in Georgia to learn about the salt marsh is Sapelo Island, home of the Sapelo Island National Estuarine Research Reserve. The reserve was established in 1976 to study and better understand the complexities of this area between land and ocean.
The reserve system, the Sapelo Island Reserve, is based upon the strategy of trying to establish reference sites in natural laboratories throughout the nation to study estuarine processes. There are 26 designated reserves within this system, and Sapelo is the second oldest. It's a new discipline. It's only about 50 years old. Now, oceanic sciences have existed for several hundred years, but this was the blending of the two, where the rivers meet the ocean in the estuarine area.
Sapelo Island, Georgia's fourth largest barrier island, is a good location to study the salt marsh habitat. Of the island's 16,500 acres, nearly 5,600 acres are tidal salt marsh.
Sapelo is a unique area. There's a tremendous history here, but there's also a tremendous natural presence as well. A relatively well-preserved and relatively intact coastal systems. You have everything from the marsh systems, the estuarine systems, maritime forest, and then into the beach side and the dune systems on the east side of the islands.
This is another Spartina.
In addition to research, a major goal of the Sapelo Island Reserve is public education.
The atmosphere and help to give it get some ease that it would normally get through its root system.
This group of students from Frederica Academy, led by naturalist Georgia Hurley, is here to learn about the marsh.
I want you to kind of be cognizant of as you're walking out into the marsh, you're going to be going downhill a little bit. So you can think more of this as kind of the border area. You can change a habitat amazingly within just a couple of inches because it all has to do out here with the amount of water. Okay? So let's just see what we've got walking down into the marshy area here.
The salt marsh is made up of many different transitional areas, from the higher zones at the edge of the maritime forest, through the high and middle marsh, to the low marsh, and into the tidal creeks. Plant and animal life in each zone differs greatly depending on elevation. The higher, drier zones surrounding the salt marsh contain more shrub-like plants, while the marsh itself is dominated by grasses. The mud in the high marsh area is firmer and easier to walk on. This ground is flooded twice daily with salt water. Therefore, the plants and animals which live here must adapt.
To compensate for all of that salt out there, the root systems of these plants start off by having sort of like cell blockers down in the roots, keeping all that, a good bit of that salt, or trying to keep a good bit of that salt out. What makes it in and up through the systems of the plant is actually exuded out onto the leaves.
The salt marsh is a grassland, and the grass that dominates more than 90% of this harsh environment is Spartina alterniflora, a tough grass that has developed ways of coping with the low oxygen content of the mud and the high salt content of the water. In some areas of the high marsh, no grass can grow at all.
Another habitat in the salt marsh, salt pans here, areas that just have so much salt concentrating in them that even the salt-tolerant plants can't handle that. And oftentimes, they just have vast numbers of fiddler crabs and periwinkle snails cruising around.
Though the salt pans are generally lacking in plant life, it's a good place to see one of the salt marsh's most plentiful residents, the fiddler crab.
And I managed to, before they all got away as we were coming down, managed to catch a couple of little crabs. So you guys can help me out here with some ID. What do we have here? How do you know that that's a male? The big claw. What's the purpose of that claw?
Fiddler crabs are known for their mating ritual. The large claw of a male crab is used to attract females. Fiddler crabs are one of the most abundant creatures in the marsh. They provide an important food source for birds, mammals, and fish throughout the year. Another shelled creature that provides an important food source in the marsh is the periwinkle snail, or marsh periwinkle. These students are learning how to coax these tiny mollusks out of their shells.
And a good, easy way to do it is put it on your throat, like this, and you just hum. And it starts to tickle them. Is yours coming out? Oh, cool. There we go. He likes you. Must be a girl.
These snails feed on algae and can be seen clinging to the marsh grass, traveling up and down the stalk as the tide comes in and recedes. Periwinkle snails have an acutely timed biological clock, which tells them when the tides will rush in.
These little guys actually feed by scraping. They have their radula scrapes at the grass blades and also at the muds.
Oh, that kind of hurt.
I'm having a lot of fun and I'm learning a lot, and it's really beautiful, and Sapelo is so cool because there's like hardly anything here and it's really natural. So
before heading to the low marsh, the group stops by the beach. Our beaches are tied to the salt marsh, and here the group will find out how this seemingly very different ecosystem benefits from the other.
We really try to get them into really what makes a beach tick, and all of the little micro habitats out there on the beach, from the intertidal zone, what's living down under the sands, what's swimming in the nearshore waters, the importance of dune systems, and really just how it's all connected. But basically, these little things are living, as I say, right below the surface. They're moving.
The group gets a close look at some of the tiny microorganisms that live within the intertidal zone, that part of the beach that is submerged twice daily. Beneath these sands, there are millions of tiny creatures which supply food to shorebirds and form the basis of the marine ecosystem here at the shore. They depend on nutrients from the salt marsh in the form of detritus.
Basically, detritus is food. Detritus is what's coloring all of our water out here. And detritus basically starts out in our salt marshes with the marsh grasses. And it's all just a part of that decomposition process. We also get a lot of worms.
The marsh also plays a vital role in the formation of the dune system. Dead marsh grass, called wrack, washes up on shore, collecting along the edge of the intertidal zone.
How do you build a dune? Anybody know the recipe for a dune?
Marsh rack.
Marsh rack. So we got wind, marsh rack, and sand. Now what's going to happen when all of this marsh rack is covered up? It's going to start heating up, decomposing, releasing nutrients that's going to fuel the pioneer plants.
After the beach, the students head to the low marsh. The low marsh is one of the harshest areas for plants, but Spartina thrives here, growing several feet tall. The water in the low marsh is filled with microorganisms, juvenile forms of sea life, and creatures feeding. It's here that many of our well-known coastal species develop. The low marsh is an important nursery for countless fish species, shrimp, and crab, which begin life as microscopic plankton.
We've got basically two types of plankton, phyto or plant plankton, and animal plankton or zooplankton. And much of that zooplankton begins its life out here right in our estuaries.
These students are sampling a tidal creek on the south end of Sapelo. Tidal creeks help direct the flow of billions of gallons of tidal water each day. These narrow channels wind through the low marsh. Along the edges of the creeks, you'll find oyster beds. You'll often see bottlenose dolphins feeding in these areas as they contain a high concentration of fish, shrimp, and crab. These students are getting a hands-on experience of our tidal creeks. Now that the students have collected some of these microorganisms, it's time to return to the lab to get a closer look.
Oh, the labs are always so much fun because there's nothing like freaking a kid out when you make them lay down on a dock and grab all that, what they think is slimy stuff under the docks there. And once you get it under a microscope or get it under a dissecting scope and they can actually see the life that's generating out there, it really just changes their perspective. Look kind of down at the far left corner there and you can see them cruising. Why it's important to introduce kids to this ecosystem, it was all here long before we were, and it's now our responsibility to take care of that. In a lot of places, we're losing all of these natural habitats, and when you can get a child or even an adult out there that can actually feel it and touch it and experience it, they remember it, and they're more likely to want to protect it a lot more.
coastal development can cause a lot of problems in the salt marsh. One of the biggest long-term concerns for the marsh involves a rising sea level.
We have a very low sloping continental shelf, and this lends us to long-term disturbances of our environment, and I'm referring primarily to global warming. With that, and with sea level rise, which is occurring at about 3 inches every 100 years on the Georgia coast, and 3 inches on the Georgia coast with a low sloping continental shelf has a significant more land interfaced by marine waters than an area, say, in the northeast or even the west coast, where 3 inches may impact a very small amount of shoreline. In Georgia, it affects feet, yards, and more. What we have from a general public perspective is the need, or the feeling of the need, to armor.
Armoring or building walls to protect homes and buildings from rising water leaves no room for the marshes to grow, essentially strangling these wetlands. Thankfully, there are protections in place to help minimize our impact on the marshlands.
The Marshland Protection Act of 1976 gives the Department of Natural Resources, i.e. the public interest, control over the marshes. So things such as dock building and impacts of these marshes are now permitted. So it's allowed the Georgia marshes to stay relatively pristine.
Marshes are important for many reasons. There are several species which exist only here. The diamondback terrapin is the only reptile that lives exclusively in the salt marsh. These fast-moving turtles nest in the higher areas. Because of this, coastal development has had an impact on their population.
These causeways that go through the marshes provide really good high ground, but they also provide good ground for rapidly moving cars to come, and so female terrapins are often hit on the roads in their pursuit of nesting grounds, and obviously a female with eggs is a big loss, and when a lot of them are being lost, it can really impact the population.
Many birds also depend on the salt marsh. The clapper rail lives, nests, and raises its young here. More often heard than viewed, these shy birds can occasionally be seen walking along the muddy banks of tidal creeks.
Let's go.
One way to experience the salt marsh is with a rod and reel. Many species of fish can be found here throughout the year, and one of the most popular is our state saltwater fish, the red drum. We caught up with a couple of pros fishing the tidal marshes.
I've been in the area for 18 years and charter fishing for a living for 12. Today we're fishing with Mike Duckworth, a good friend of mine.
In the marsh, you can catch red drum both at high tide and low tide. First, Mike and Greg try their hand at fishing the muddy banks when the water's at its lowest level.
For the most part, low tide, especially in the winter, the fish will really school up tight, and they'll get on that dark, dark mud to keep warm during the winter.
The red drum, also called redfish or spotted bass, spends much of its life close to shore, using the marsh for reproduction and to feed.
All right, I think he's through. I think he's through.
I'll tell you what, now he's done. Wow. Man, that's cool.
As the tide comes in, it creates an entirely different opportunity to catch red drum. On tides as high as 7 feet, redfish come into the shallow flooded plains to hunt for fiddler crabs. The water can be as shallow as just a few inches, so there's no need for a motor. Instead, Mike uses a pole to push this flat-bottomed boat through the flooded marsh.
What we're doing is waiting for the tides to get up high in the marsh and actually going out, poling the skiff through the marsh and seeing these redfish with their tails out of the water. I see the ripples.
If we didn't have this wind, I could hit him from here.
What these fish are doing is in here feeding on fiddler crabs and shrimp. You can actually see the fish standing on their heads.
Typically the fish will not move. You know, if there's fish around the low tide, those same areas are going to hold fish at high tide. So, you know, I'll go back to different areas. I've looked, you know, found some fish at low tide, go back at high tide and check it out. And I'm just looking for those tails sticking up or some sort of motion. I think it's the hunt. It's combining hunting and fishing. I'll try to get out in front of them here.
You're golden. The best time is anytime the tide gets right. And when I say right, when you have 7.5+ foot tide, it could fall in the morning and it could fall in the afternoon. Fish on. Wow.
Because the tides are constantly shifting, there's a small window of opportunity to do this sort of fishing before the water recedes, exposing the dry mud. Luckily, it's a good afternoon for these two, and they score a 20-pounder.
Oh, how about that? Well, anything that you can go sight fish for is always a big thrill. And man, anything that you can see and throw to is, man, that's a lot of fun. All right, we'll let this guy grow up.
Fishing is a great way to enjoy the salt marsh. This muddy grassland is brimming with activity. The next time you're traveling down one of our coastal highways, stop for a moment and take in the magnificent beauty of these vibrant prairies of life.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible by a grant from Mary Hall Singleton and by the Imlay Foundation.